Would like to welcome Sam Smith. He's an intern historian with the San Luis Obispo Coast District of California State Parks. Currently, Sam is an undergraduate student at Cal Poly SLO with an intent to graduate with a degree in history and global politics minor. Prior to his internship with California State Parks, Sam worked as an educator with the Guadalupe Nipomo Dune Center, creating activities that inform students about the natural history of the Central Coast. After graduation, Sam plans to pursue a career in academia, studying foreign relations and contemporary American involvement within the Middle East. Thank you so much, Sam, for taking time out of your day to share this wonderful presentation with us. I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you for all who are attending right now. Welcome to Living by the Sea. This project has been a couple months in the making, and I am very excited to share it with all of you. And I hope that, if nothing else, you can take something away from this and perhaps learn a little something about the history of the Central Coast and how citizens have interacted with the ocean. Before we go into this presentation, I just want to go over a little brief overview. I'm sure that you may have had a rundown already in an email, but just to clarify, I'd like to just overlook the steps and kind of the chronology of this project. So this talks about the history of Central Coast citizens' reliance on the ocean. This starts roughly 10,000 years ago in Chumash and Salinan times, and it plans to kind of go in a semi-chronological order over the evolution of citizens' reliance on the Pacific Ocean. So this evolves from Chumash Salinan to Spanish conquest, and then slowly moves into American involvement along with the gold rush, and then also involvement from Chinese and Japanese citizens. And I hope that by the end, we will be able to move into contemporary times and kind of get an overview on how the events in the past have connected to the present and the contemporary. So without further ado, I will get started. If you have any questions, like Robin said, please put them in the Q&A. We will answer all questions afterwards. So please hold your questions or just submit them, and I will get to them as soon as we are done. Yes, so for centuries, the ocean has remained the iconic centerpiece of the Central Coast, as many of you may know. From trade, agriculture, everything in between. Residents of the Central Coast have long relied on the Pacific Ocean for survival. So without further ado, let's take a closer look at the history. And just for reference, here is a map. This is kind of our reference point for today. So on the bottom of this side over here, you will see Point San Luis, and you will also see this is roughly Montaña del Oro Park, and we move up through Cayucas and all the way up to eventually Ragged Point. So this is kind of the focus point for the Central Coast today. Obviously, there are broader definitions of the Central Coast, but just for the sake of reference, we are referring to anywhere between Point San Luis to Ragged Point and all cities and townships in between. So thousands of years ago, before the Central Coast was subject to Spanish or American influence, Chumash and Salinan tribes made up the entirety of the human population. A strong majority of these tribes live by the Central Coast because the ocean as a resource was constantly reliable to provide the necessary resources for survival. The ocean was used for harvesting seaweed, hunting marine mammals like seals, and repurposing wildlife, like the abalone shell container you see on the left. And here is a sandstone pestle created by the Chumash to grind material. Given that there is such a close reliance on the ocean, sandstone was oftentimes used and chopped up to make certain tools in order to craft food or certain things like that for everyday life. And in addition to using the ocean directly, these groups also use many plants for survival. So coastal plants like marshes and by marshes and estuaries were utilized to weave baskets and duck traps. And like I previously said, sandstone was also carved into objects like pestles in order to mash fruit and other materials. There is some information in this short video, however, it is a little bit redundant. So If you would like, after this presentation, you are free to watch this video on the map that will be published with California State Parks. However, for sake of time, we will brush over this and continue. Yes, I can try to speak up. Apologies. Let me know if there's any other difficulties with hearing me. I will try to maintain my voice. But the Chumash and Salinans made use of these sustainable oceanic practices to live along the Central Coast for thousands of years, until the colonization by Spanish between the 18th and 19th centuries brought upon drastic consequences, which sort of usher us more into the contemporary side of the Central Coast that we see today. So, in 1542, Spanish explorer Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo visited the Central Coast. Cabrillo spent days exploring what he dubbed El Morro, otherwise known as Morro Bay. You might know, you might see the name Cabrillo pop up in areas around the Central Coast. This is due to him and kind of the influence, controversial influence at that he had on the Central Coast. Nearly 200 years after the Portola expedition begins a near century-long period of Spanish reign in California. And this is absolutely devastating to Chumash and Salinan populations by introducing a lot of new diseases that, unfortunately, the immunity was not there and had drastic effects on the population, wiping a large majority of Chumash and Salinan peoples from existence, which is very unfortunate. As the Spanish began to monopolize trade along the Central Coast, California agriculture and hunting industries absolutely boomed. The picture you see right here is seal hunting that was happening around the 1940s. Obviously, a hop, skip, and a jump away from Spanish times, but as you can tell, it remained a prevalent industry for a long time. So by the early 1800s, you had cattle ranching and sea otter hunting, which were the most profitable industries on the coastline. Now, of course, these coastal hunting operations absolutely wrecked sea otter populations, but conversely, they also skyrocketed trade. So hundreds of ships would eventually come into the California coastline after 1800, including areas like San Luis Obispo and Morro Bay, in order to trade for these sea otter pelts. And while this had a very negative influence on the biodiversity of the region, it greatly influenced the human biodiversity, if you will. So as trading exploded, the Spanish took full control of major trading ports like Los Angeles and San Diego, and they actually banned Americans from trading there. You had lots of Americans that were kind of going in, like many other countries at the time, assuming that it was sort of free game. But considering that the Spanish had arrived and sort of colonized it first, they were just taking full control of the coastline and all the ports. Here's Avila Port around 1905. And so as a result, less monitored ports in smaller towns like Port San Luis Obispo became hotspots for trading between foreign and local merchants. Since the Central Coast was relatively untouched by this, given that they were mostly in areas like Los Angeles and San Diego, the ports of the area actually served very well for contraband. These locations, which are better known as Doghole Ports, boosted small deals of private trade. So contraband actually flourished in the areas around San Luis Obispo. This area, Spooner's Cove, which you might have seen in Montaña de Oro, used to be one of these Doghole ports. And while there wasn't always contraband coming out of these ports, it would remain prevalent. And one American trader in particular, actually Captain William Shailer, greatly helped influence the American, or increase the American influence along the Central Coast. He was run out of San Diego by the Spanish after a trade dispute, and so he took his ship north to San Luis Obispo. Despite the fact that he was not received well by the locals and actually kind of had a beef going on with the padre of the mission, he actually also greatly influenced local trade, saying that he got plentiful supplies of provisions as usual, and he was not unsuccessful in the collection of furs. He is referring to sea otters and seals, of course. And so his report of successful trade along the Central Coast was actually reported back to the American government and created an influx of international commerce, leading many to invest in the local economy of San Luis Obispo. The cattle industry that I had previously mentioned, along with the otter industry, would remain popular for years until disasters and miracles alike created an entirely new landscape. And this landscape kind of sets the precedent for the rest of this presentation. This is an extremely important paradigm shift that sets a series of numerous paradigm shifts that kind of create the landscape that many of you are familiar with on the Central Coast today. And just as a reference point, we are in the mid to late 1800s by this point. So here's a reference. This is San Luis Obispo, 1877. But by 1848, Alta California, otherwise known as Spanish California, was on the cusp of a series of events that would forever change it. The gold rush hits California in early 1848 at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, up in Northern California. Here's a picture of Sutter's Mill. And as a result, the official gold rush begins, and settlers from all sides of the world come as fast as possible to capitalize on the moment and try to strike rich. Of course, the gold rush is rapidly successful, but conversely rapidly declines soon after. So it brings a booming economy to California, and its admission as an American state in 1850 further enticed immigrants to explore the California landscape. And you can see citizens here. This is at Portsmouth Square, celebrating the admission of California into the United States. Huge historical moment, and it has effects statewide, including the Central Coast. So as the gold rush hits its stride, the cattle ranching industry in SLO is still in full swing. And you can see you had plenty of ranches just like this one pictured to your left that were completely taking up the coastline. And these were the wealthy of the day. These were the wealthiest citizens that lived in San Luis Obispo County, and they made serious profit off of cattle ranching. And their property stretched all the way to the coastline. By the early 1860s, however, the cattle ranching industry actually took a significant turn for the worst as one of the worst and costliest droughts of California history hits. This is in the 1850s and takes place in precedent over the next several years. So hot winds and grasshopper infestations ravaged the Central Coast landscape, killing many cattle, and killed enough apparently to actually make it into artwork. If you see this picture of Mission San Miguel in the back, you might see these couple dots in the background, kind of in the midground right before the mission in the background, and those are actually dead cattle. So you can tell that the cattle industry was in such shambles that it was very prevalent even in the arts. So with the cattle ranching industry in shambles, the Central Coast was in dire need of new industries to sustain the economy. Cattle ranchers soon switched to dairy cows, and a lot of them had 20 to 25 dairy cows by the mid-1860s. And this was a very, very smart decision by those cattle ranchers. So, of course, the influx of immigrants that had come over to the gold rush, that still made the opportunity perfect to capitalize on California landscape. And regardless of the previously impactful drought, European immigrants, primarily those who are Swiss Italians, moved down to the Central Coast and integrated themselves into the growing dairy industry. The Swiss Italians were already notorious for their prowess in the dairy industries in Marin and Sonoma counties up in Northern California. And one of these immigrants in particular, Joseph Fiscalini, actually became one of the earliest residents in the Central Coast to sort of ignite this Swiss dairy boom. Arriving to the Central Coast in 1876, Fiscalini worked as a cow milker for Cambria resident Morgan Bryans on this dairy that you actually see here to the right. And Fiscalini would milk up to 30 cows a day, often working in harsher climates for little pay. He would sacrifice not purchasing winter clothes and things like that in order to make sure that he would have enough money to just make a sustainable living. After 2 years' time with Morgan Bryans, Fiscalini finally works up enough money to own his dairy farming operation, and he goes with John Filipponi and leases out land owned by the Hearst family in Green Valley, which is not very green. I took this picture a couple weeks back, and unfortunately now it's kind of a tan beigeish valley. But he goes to Green Valley and produces products like milk, butter, and cheese. After a year had passed, they made a net profit of $2,000, which was just slightly over 50 grand in 2020. After Filipponi's unexpected death in 1879, however, Fiscalini had to run the entire operation on his own. And after his success, this actually spread a lot of influence to the Swiss Italian community and inspired a lot of them to come by the coastline and prioritize in cheese and butter making for the next 30 years after. Due to the success of the dairy operations in the Central Coast, they actually started to work together and form what they call dairy cooperatives. The first of these was between the Cambria and Home Creameries in 1894. And this operation was successful until a fire that tore through the county burned both creameries to the ground. Unfortunate. Improvements of coastal travel, however, primarily paving roads and making sure that cars were durable enough to actually drive along the coastline, inspired others to reignite dairy cooperatives. In 1907, businessman M.G. Salmina establishes the second dairy cooperative in SLO County with the Harmony Valley Creamery Association, otherwise known as HVCA. The HVCA was extremely successful. By 1914, they had actually produced over 200,000 pounds of butter and 100,000 pounds of cheese, which is a lot of cheese and butter. And in fact, the HVCA garnered such a large reputation that it actually became a supplier of the Challenge Butter Company, which you probably see in stores. That same Challenge Butter is the one that kind of made slow coastal creameries and dairies very prominent, not only on the Central Coast, but statewide. And their membership as a product would grow. And in 1936, it peaked at around 400 members. And here's some pictures of cattle grazing on a beach in California. I'm not sure if this is the Central Coast, but it is a nice image to look at nonetheless. But of course, dairy and cattle were not the only significant industries along the Central Coast. Another one that, albeit was only around for a short amount of time, that still held a significant precedent when it existed, was whaling. In the 1860s, Portuguese immigrants started investing in the Central Coast in what would be the first and last whaling operation. In 1863, a Portuguese immigrant known as Machado, but known to his colleagues as Joseph Clark, moved down to San Simeon Point after developing heavy notoriety for his whaling skills in Monterey. He purchases 12 acres of land from George Hurst and creates a whaling station that's nearly identical to the previous one he worked at in Monterey. He turned significant profit between 1864 to 1867 due to a practically untapped market. At this point, he really didn't have a huge operation going on. It was mainly just himself, but he was catching these whales with a couple other people and turned what today would be six-figure sums. So with these funds, he was able to purchase plenty of new update equipment. This included new boats with harpoon guns, 200-gallon rendering vats to refine the whale blubber, and a wharf to actually capture the whales. But this process, although it was exhilarating and quite the adrenaline rush, was both very intricate and tedious. Teams of 6 and 7 would actually work night and day to look out for whales. Once found, they would signal other whalers by waving a flag at Piedras Blancas Point and yelling "whale ho." Whalers used 2 30-foot-long boats to chase after the whales. Using harpoons and bombs, these whales were actually killed, and then using just these small teams of these boats, they would actually have to grab the harpoons and drag these several-ton whales back to the coastline. And you can see this one down here. I don't know if I can, there we go. It's a bit of a grainy image, but this is a beached whale in San Simeon in the early 20th century. Due to limited resources, Clark's team used what they could to refine blubber. This blubber was often melted in vats using fire sparked by nearby driftwood. In order to get fresh water to actually help melt some of the fat, they would actually have to go all the way up to areas like Ragged Point to find wells that actually had fresh water, because San Simeon at the time was very stripped of resources, and really there wasn't that much industry going on in San Simeon either. But when the blubber was fully boiled down and refined, it was shipped out of San Simeon Point and passed along to San Francisco. He produced over 500 barrels of oil from 14 whales in 1879, and a couple decades after, the operation remained majorly successful and raked in thousands of dollars. In 1891, he sadly passed away as the whale population declined. His property was purchased back by the Hearst family, But unfortunately, it really fizzled out. There were some small whaling operations all the way up until 1914, but for the most part, it was non-existent. So we have this quick video on Simeon whaling industry. However, I'm checking the clock and I see that already about 15 to 20 minutes have passed by. So I'm going to skip this for now. However, if you'd like to check it out, it is on the California State Parks San Luis Obispo Coast YouTube page. I highly advise. It goes into some more detail. Not that long of a video, but it's an informative one nonetheless. But of course, the European immigrants were not the only ones to seize opportunity on the Central Coast. And immigrants from the Pacific came in large numbers as well after the gold rush, trying to take advantage of this same booming economy. And they primarily came in through San Francisco and Angel Island. So in the early in the early 1850s, Chinese immigrants first began to settle in the United States, arriving at the aforementioned Angel Island. And the reasons varied. Some were kind of pulled in by the fact that there was such an economic gold mine, no pun intended, and other ones were kind of pushed out by the Taiping Rebellion and a kind of ushered as there was a lot of civil unrest in China. Throughout the 1850s, many Chinese realized that they would need to look into industries past the gold rush in order to provide a sustainable living. So, you know, you had railroad workers and a lot of infrastructure workers. But by the 1860s, you also had many Chinese immigrants that slowly made their way down the coastline and settled in Slow County, of all places. Once arriving in the county, Chinese families sought to take advantage of the coastline by taking up various forms of farming. So these families rented out small spaces by the direct coastline from local ranchers, often paying as little as $1 a year for rent. These areas by the coastline were relatively unused by these ranchers, and so they were really just willing to lend them out at a very affordable price. And one of these areas is China Harbor, which is located between Estero Bluffs and Harmony Headlands. Unfortunately, China Harbor is a private location, but here's a little picture on Google Images for reference. And so early on, as the Chinese settled, they made multiple discoveries that would eventually be crucial to what would become booming Central Coast industries. These included coastal abalone and seaweed, and they provided the Chinese with a sustainable living that would relatively go unchallenged for decades after. The amount of abalone along the Central Coast was seemingly infinite, according to some, with American nationals really having no interest in consuming the shellfish. Americans and a lot of European immigrants were kind of grossed out by the prospect of consuming abalone. They felt it was very rubbery and chewy and just kind of a very odd and obscure thing to eat at the time. But contrarily, abalone was viewed as a delicacy for the wealthy in China. And so when Chinese immigrants soon realized that they were sitting upon an abundance of abalone, it was, it was absolutely an incredible discovery. And they needed to quickly jump at the bit to fish the animal and export it to the Chinese mainland. And notably, this has marked the first time since Chumash and Salina times when abalone shells were used as containers that abalone was actually widely fished and captured along the Central Coast. All the while, seaweed farming was also equally untapped, leading many Chinese families to build cabins out of driftwood along Central Coast rental properties. This cabin you see right here is actually a cabin that was owned at China Point by seaweed farmer Hao Wang. We will actually get into Hao Wang in a little bit, so I will hold off on any details for now. But between Cayucas and San Simeon, dozens of Chinese immigrants farmed what is known as olva, a specific type of edible seaweed found exclusively, nearly exclusively along the Central Coast. Despite difficult communication, though, between farmers and traders, abalone and seaweed were initially successful. Neither industry was really well documented because, historically speaking, I don't think that anybody in the Central Coast really knew the influence they would have. But in 1869, a record of a Chinese product, which I suspect can either be olva or abalone, shipped out of San Simeon Point for $3,000, indicating that these businesses did in fact turn a respectable profit. And despite the fact that a lot of Chinese immigrants did not interfere with pre-existing businesses in the abalone and seaweed farming industries, statewide rampant anti-Chinese sentiments completely plagued California from the 1870s onward. You may have seen things like this before with the Chinese Exclusion Act and these sort of pieces of very racist propaganda that just were all over in that time. A very odd time, to say the least. And by the 1880s, racist sentiments had kind of reached a pinnacle, and several exclusion acts prohibited immigration into California and also incoming trade from China. So commerce went quiet for a while, and these Chinese abalone and seaweed farming operations just remained dormant. Of course, this was not the end. After 2 decades of silence, abalone would once again resurface in popularity in the late 1890s with the arrival of Japanese immigrants. And sparked by Japanese woodcutters' rediscovery of shellfish in Monterey County, word of abalone made its way to the Japanese government. And when the Japanese government got word of this, they immediately sent for foreign assistance regarding this, and they wanted to capitalize off the abalone fishing operations. The Japanese immigrants were actually using a lot more rigorous farming methods than what the Chinese had used, including lots of deep sea diving and the lot. And so they gathered abalone in much deeper waters at a much higher rate. By the turn of the century, almost 400,000 pounds of abalone were fished statewide, and a majority of those were farmed along the Central Coast and Southern California. So similar to the Chinese just 2 decades ago, tensions grew over the Japanese success, and many politicians enacted laws limiting the capacity of Japanese fishing. And this was kind of under the pretense to protect the abalone per se. In retrospect, this is another one of those very racially motivated laws. So despite this, the only law that adversely affects Japanese businesses in San Luis Obispo County was a mandate that required farming abalone would reach a circumference of 15 inches so that abalone were not prematurely farmed and so that they retain their population as farming continued. So as a result, in areas like Cayucas and San Simeon, in contrast to the rest of the state, continue to flourish, remaining successful for decades onward. And you actually had giant abalone fishing operations. Once again, a bit of a gritty image, but all these rows you see are abalone racks in Cayucas. And that same image actually in a much clearer format, just to compare to today. So here is 1910, where it is completely just an abalone farming operation. And nearly a century later, a recreational beach and a tourist destination. Obviously, abalone don't have as strong of a footing in Cayucas anymore. But as you can tell, the main structures of the land are still there. And so during this time that the Japanese were, profiting and capitalizing off abalone, Chinese citizens were actually permitted to export products to China without the assistance of Chinese traders arriving in the bay first. So as a product, the Chinese seaweed farmers who lived between San Simeon and Cayucas finally it once again exploded. And those same Chinese immigrants from decades ago were still living in these coastal cabins, paying relatively low rates. And finally, they could really capitalize once again off these industries. So while some were second generation seaweed farmers, other newcomers arrived to the coast directly from China, expanding the seaweed industry. And one of these new immigrants, as I'd mentioned before, was a seaweed farmer named Hao Wang. And Hao Wang lived along the coast for decades, building a cabin between Estero Bluffs and Harmony Headlands to farm seaweed with his wife, Suk Hing. And this right here is a very clear image of the cabin. This is, once again, at China Point between Estero Bluffs and Harmony Headlands. And so the process of cultivating seaweed was regarded as somewhat as sort of an art form. It wasn't your traditional farming operation, and the process that it went through was actually kind of relaxing, if you will. It was quite interesting. So Hao Wang and his wife would take lumber scraps from the land, and they would actually use a kerosene torch and set those on fire, and they would set fire to coastal rocks until only this aforementioned oval remained. So you would have all of these coastal rocks like this one right here, just completely ablaze until eventually ova remained. And after only ova grew, Hao Wang and his team of cultivators swam out to the rocks using floatable devices and slice the seaweed off by hand. They would just take sharp objects and cut them up and eventually place them into baskets like you see right here, and would carry them up to the flat land above. Here's a quote from Bill Martney, who is a Central Coast resident and actually former cultivator of Hao Wong's. And Hao Wong would have a bamboo pole and 2 baskets on either side. He was phenomenally strong. If you see right here, this person's figure on the left is Bill Martney, and in the middle is Hao Wong. And so Hao Wong was regarded to really, he was quite scrawny, not that heavy set, yet he could carry multiple pounds of wet seaweed up the coastline every single day. And so despite his look, he's a very, very strong individual and could carry large amounts of seaweed up the coastline. And so up to 80 pounds of this ova would be picked off the rocks in one go and set to dry in these 2x2 squares called neats on the flat land. And as you can see right here, once again, bit of a grainy image, but as you can see, these are being laid out in these neats, and his wife, Sukking, right there laying out the ova. They would dry over the course of several days, becoming 15% of what their original weight was and packed into knapsacks. And after the seaweed was packed, Hao Wong would transport it to the Bay Area and eventually China. And this seaweed initially traveled by boat to San Simeon, but towards the end of his life, Hao Wong took these by truck and actually delivered the ova to San Francisco himself. Wong and his wife, like many other seaweed farmers at the time, made just enough off of exports to self-sustain. It was never entirely a very fruitful business, but it wasn't a business that didn't rake in any money either. So that sort of soft spot they found themselves in allowed them to maintain a cabin lifestyle for years. And a quick art piece of that cabin is right here. Yes, a couple weeks ago, I actually interviewed Bill Martney, and he regarded this entire operation as a chapter in history that they could never forget. And they were lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. Of course, once again, this is not the only operation that is occurring on the Central Coast at this time. And while sea agriculture was popular, the land agriculture was also very popular as well. Japanese farmers like the Nagano and Eto families took control of much of the coastal agriculture in the early 20th century. Here's the Nagano family actually on their farm in the early 20th century. And specializing in row crops, both families established a great deal of Central Coast agriculture in Los Osos Valley. Flower seed, peas, beans, artichoke are just a few of these crops grown. And the Japanese, along with Filipino immigrants, spent days picking these crops in the field. And here are a few of those Filipino workers actually picking these crops up. And as you can tell, right behind them is Morro Rock. So this was directly on the coastline. And innovation along the coastline during this time was prevalent as well. George Nagano of the Nagano family was actually one of the first farmers to introduce avocado crops on the Central Coast. And evidently, decades later, we have seen how strong of a footing avocado has held in California, becoming one of the most popular areas in the world to produce avocados. And both families had connections that allowed their crops to be sold statewide, and they would be often sold in San Francisco at farmers markets like this, and just kind of sold directly off the truck. And that's how they would turn profit. Of course, they also held influence over the local market. This is actually the Watanabe Market in San Luis Obispo, which unfortunately now is defunct, but back then was one of the more popular produce markets in San Luis Obispo and the Central Coast in general. And so a lot of the crops that were produced by the Naganos and Etos would be sold at this market. By the late 1930s, the Japanese held a major footing on the entire agricultural industry between Morro Bay and Cayucas, owning these very large farms along the coastline. But in order to protect produce prices, Tameji Eto actually established the South Central Japanese Agricultural Association, which was one of the first unionization efforts of agriculture along the Central Coast to help protect produce. And while it did protect prices, it unfortunately would not last long. As many of you may know, when the onset of the Second World War occurred and the attack of Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese sentiments peaked, and they were at a rate that was very similar to the anti-Chinese sentiments of the 1800s. And of course, when President Roosevelt established Executive Order 9066, the internment camps that were produced as a product would alter every Japanese farming family, not only on the Central Coast, but in California. And once again, the Central Coast was to be experiencing changes that would relatively alter it forever. And this sort of brings us into the contemporary. And so the current landscape of Central Coast is far-fetched from what it was prior to the Second World War. The Japanese tenant farmers who were initially farming all these crops took a sharp decline in their numbers after the installation of internment camps. As many were forcibly removed from their homes, they and the many Filipino field workers who assisted them became out of employment and a living space. And only a few of these operations remained afterwards, as some were lucky enough to pass off the rights to their land to their neighbors, and some of those neighbors were nice enough to upkeep and hold the land for when they were returned from the internment camps to actually keep the operation going contemporarily. So one of those families is the Nagano family. And though they were lucky, a lot of the other families never returned to the Central Coast. So those who did, like the Naganos, continue to live along the Central Coast today, anywhere between Santa Maria and Cayucas, farming strawberries, artichokes, and more. But after the 1949 Communist Revolution in China, where Mao Zedong took control, many trade routes between China and the United States were extremely severed, and that also damaged the seaweed industry. So actually, after a while, by the 1970s, Hao Wang was the only seaweed farmer that remained on the Central Coast. And this would last until 1975, when he unfortunately passed away. And while attempts have been made since then to revitalize the industry, it really hasn't gotten a footing, and seaweed farming is relatively, if not completely, non-existent. Abalone farming follows a similar fate. However, there are still a few farming operations that exist near Cayucas, with the majority of Japanese families who once farmed abalone pursuing different industries contemporarily. There is actually also near China Harbor a abalone farm, which I'm not entirely sure. I may need to check. That may be defunct as of now, but at least as of a few years ago, within the past decade, that abalone site was still up and running. And while fishing still exists in small numbers around San Simeon, commercial fishing and whaling operations that existed a century ago are long gone. And obviously, given that whaling has been outlawed, I personally don't see whaling coming back anytime soon. But the same cannot be said about all this for the dairy industry, which still holds a very prevalent footing on the Central Coast. Although it's not entirely run by Swiss Italians anymore, the inland dairies from Paso Robles to Cal Poly create tons of milk and butter yearly. And so that's still held a strong footing, as you can still buy a lot of local dairy products in San Luis Obispo County. And of course, the Chumash and Salinan tribes continue to exist on the Central Coast. And though they are in far smaller numbers than 10,000 years prior, these communities still contribute greatly to the evolution of Central Coast industry, continuing a history that continues to be told. So the next time you ever enter Montaña de Oro, Estero Bluffs, Harmony Headlands, San Simeon State Park, Ragged Point, anywhere in between, I urge you to consider the centuries of history that have made up this land and kind of evolved it to make it become what it is today. And though a lot of these areas are state parks now, they weren't always this way. And these lands held and supported all walks of life, from trade to agriculture and everything in between, that, if nothing else, showed that Central Coast citizens live by the sea. So that is our presentation. I want to just say a brief thank you to the Martini family, Cal Poly SLO History Center, and the numerous other institutions that were able to provide us images for this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.